Welcome to chapter 13. We're going to be talking about consideration in this chapter. And first of all, let me apologize. There was some ambient noise in the last lecture. I'm sorry about that. It's just some thudding in the background. I don't think it'll have a major distraction for you. Most of you will listen to the lecture live on Teams, but I'm sorry for that. And when I redo the slides next time, I will try to eliminate that. But let's talk about chapter 13, which is consideration. It's one of the parts of contract. Remember I said, you could look at these as 6 different elements. And the first one sometimes is actually subdivided: agreement and offer are treated as separate elements, but offer and acceptance. So let's talk about consideration. Let's talk about what can and can't be consideration, how we're going to deal with it. We're going to be using that legal term, that Latin term that I introduced in the general discussion of contracts in that first chapter, of quid pro quo. Quid meaning literally this, pro for, quo that, this for that. Consideration means that there is a passage from each side, from the person that is making the offer and the person is making acceptance. Both of them are exchanging something. Typically, as I said, one side's paying money, the other side's giving goods, services. So we say there is a bargained for exchange, or quid pro quo. It is not a gift. Gift has a much different set of laws around it. We have gifts in causa mortis, which is gifts in anticipation of death. We have testimonial gifts, which are gifts made after death. We have gifts inter vivos, which are gifts given during life. So you can see that all of those are different. One of the questions we ask about consideration is, does it have any legal value? If there's no value to what you're giving, you're not giving consideration, it starts to look like a gift. So a bargain for exchange, quid pro quo, and that it has legal value. These are the elements of consideration. Now, what we're talking about here most of the time is a bilateral contract. And at its simplest analysis of a bilateral contract, you've got promises to perform flowing both ways. I promise to sell you my watch. You promise to buy my watch. And that's a bilateral contract. Bilateral meaning 2 parts. The offerer is offering to sell, and the buyer is offering to buy. They are both promising performance. I'm going to give you the watch, and you're going to give me the money. When we say a promise, obviously promises are something that are completed in the future. They're not completed at the moment. They're completed, it can be moments in the future, but it's completed in the future. If you are looking at the legal sufficiency of consideration, if it is a promise, it can be a promise to act. I will hand you the watch. I will pay the money. I will do X. I will do Y. So it can be a promise to act, or it can be a promise not to act. Now, I put something in here that a few years ago might not be very smart. Promising not to smoke dope or marijuana. Right now in North Carolina, it's legal for medicinal purposes, and in, I think it's 13 or 19 states now, for recreational purposes to smoke marijuana. But let's suppose that I, as maybe your father, don't want you to smoke marijuana. So I might say, well, if you will agree not to smoke marijuana, then I will pay for your college education. That would be a promise on one side of whatever the value of the college education is, for your promise not to act in a certain way, forbearance. And since marijuana is legal in many states, you'd be giving up a legal right. But if if I said, if you agree not to use cocaine or use heroin, well, then we'd have the question, well, are you really giving up any legal right here? Because you don't have a right to do those things anyway. So typically in a bilateral contract, it can be the changing, the destruction, or the modification of a legal relationship or a legal right. So it could be the changing of the right of lawsuit, for example. Legal sufficiency. Whatever you're going to agree to has to be legally detrimental to the person making the promise and legally beneficial to the party receiving the promise. Otherwise, we're kind of stuck back in the gift. Okay, adequacy of consideration. In other words, how fair does it have to be? Does it have to be a good deal? And the general answer there is no. We're not terribly concerned with whether you're making a smart decision. So let's suppose that okay. So my son is he's older now, but he was a big fanatic of the Titanic when it came out, and very interested. We heard all about it at dinner tables, and we went on tours of Titanic expeditions so it was interesting. But we were watching the Antique Roadshow one day, and there was an extremely ugly picture of a Titanic that someone had made right around the time the Titanic sank. It was a very poorly executed watercolor. I'm going to use this example through a lot of things, so pay a little attention to this. The person went into a shop in Southampton, which was the home port of the Titanic, Southampton in England. And he bought this watercolor for £500, which was a lot of money for a very bad painting. Let's suppose it was $500 to make it easier. Would you say, well, you bought a really ugly painting and you overpaid a lot for it, therefore there wasn't good consideration for the contract? Well, the answer there is no. We don't. If you want to buy something really ugly and you want to pay a lot of money for it, we are not going to second guess you and say, well, that wasn't a good decision. We're going to make you, be able to get out of the contract. The general rule is we do not inquire into whether it is a good or a bad deal. If you want to buy an ugly painting for a lot of money, knock yourself out. There are, however, exceptions. Was fraud going on? Was duress going on? Was there undue influence? Was there lack of a bargain for exchange? So, fraud, where you tricked into something, where you thought you were buying something when you really weren't buying it. You thought that this was a Titanic painting by a famous artist, and indeed it wasn't. And the person selling it to you represented it as a famous artist. Well, that would be fraud. That would affect the adequacy of consideration. You'd be able to rescind the contract. Duress. Duress is typically the most extreme form of what we would call undue influence. Duress is an immediate physical threat where I compel you to commit an action you wouldn't do because I'm threatening you with harm. So I say to you, you're going to buy this painting or I'm going to shoot you in the foot. And you say, sure, here's the $500, I'll buy the painting. That would be duress. If later we could show that you threatened me with a gun to make me buy the painting, then I could get out of the contract. Now, undue influence is a lesser level of duress. Sometimes it's not physical. Sometimes it's just overcoming the natural inclinations of the buyer. This can happen when someone in a powerful position influences another person to purchase or enter into contract. So, for example, let's suppose I'm taking care of an elderly relative who really needs me to take care of her Otherwise, she will, wind up in a nursing home. It's a terrible situation. And I say, well, Grandma, I want you to buy this really ugly painting, and I want you to pay $50,000. And if you don't, I don't think I'm going to come over to the house anymore. I'm not going to feed you. I'm not going to take care of you. I'm not going to do all these things that I do for you. Well, that would begin to get to the point where we'd say, well, is she really buying the painting, or is she, trying to get something from a caretaker? And again, you can see that there'd be all sorts of levels of this. We can also say there was no true bargained exchange, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So one of the things that tends to trigger our concern is, was the consideration grossly inadequate? Because not that grossly inadequate consideration is wrong, but that it is evidence of some other problem. So sometimes if you paid $5,000 for a really ugly painting, it might mean there's fraud. Or if you paid $5,000 for nothing and you've got a bullet wound, it might tell you duress. Or maybe if someone that you were the caretaker of, you were caring for a paraplegic, and they bought your beat up car for $5,000 and it was only worth $1,000. That'd be evidence found through influence. It would be grossly inadequate consideration, and it would show those things. Mostly inadequate consideration really attacks the idea that there's a true bargain for exchange. Now, what is not consideration? One of the first things that's not consideration is a pre-existing duty. If there is a duty that is imposed by law or previous contract, and you do it, that's not consideration for you to get more money. So if I have a contract that you says you're going to paint my house for $1,000, and you come and you say, all right, I painted your house, give me $2,000, or I'm going to make a stink, or I'm going to, well, you've already done that. You had a pre-existing duty to paint it for $1,000. I don't have to pay you another $1,000. If I have a duty to do something, you do not, it is not consideration if that duty already exists to more contracts. Now, here's an example where that happened, a true historical example. Back in the days of sail, very fast ships called clipper ships would sail to foreign ports, and the way they made their money is they would get to these ports, primarily China, they would get very high value cargo and would get it home very, very fast. They were the fastest ships in the world. It really relied upon them to make money doing this fast. If they couldn't do it fast, they would lose money. So sometimes they would get to these ports in China, and the crew would say, well, I know we have a duty to sail the ship back to Boston or New York, but we're not going to do that unless you give us a new contract and pay us more money. See, they already had a pre-existing duty to sail back for X amount of money, but now they're demanding more. Sometimes these captains, in order to get the ship to sail, would sign these contracts, and later on it would go to court, and the courts would say, well, I'm sorry, crew, you don't get the extra money because you didn't really have a right to it. Now, sometimes there's unforeseen difficulties that could change this. So suppose we had an underlying contract for me to paint your house for $1,000, and an unforeseen difficulty arises. Half the boards of the house are rotten and they have to be replaced, and that's an unforeseen difficulty. Well, then the additional $1,000 would be reasonable for me to pay, even though there was a pre-existing duty for me to paint your house. Sometimes we rescind the contract. Now, we got to be careful that there's not undue influence here or a breach underlying, but sometimes we have a contract, we both walk away from it, and we sign a new contract. So we had a duty, but we end the contract and start a new one. That's rescission. Past consideration is no consideration. You don't get paid twice for the same amount of work. So if everybody in your company, when they retired at 50 years, got a gold watch, and you retired and you didn't get a gold watch, you can't say, well, where's my gold watch? I'm entitled to it. No, you've already been paid for the years you worked. Now, it may not be nice, it may not be fair, it may lack a certain sense of justice, but you're not. Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry. So the general rule is that past consideration is no consideration. You can't substitute what you did in the past for more money today, in other words. All right, let's talk about illusory promises a little bit. What's an illusory promise? This is a promise without any real compensation. I see these most often when an amateur, someone who's not a lawyer, drafts a contract, because they want to make sure that if they don't like the contract, they can get out. So they'll often put a clause in, a cancellation clause, that reads something like this: If I don't want to perform this contract, I can walk away whenever I want to walk away without any penalty whatsoever, and I can do it up to the moment of performance. Well, guess what? That's essentially saying there's no contract. That's essentially saying you don't have to live up to any of the conditions of the contract, so it's illusory that you have a contract. If I promise to buy what I want when I want, it's not a real contract. Now, this can be a real problem when you create option contracts. So usually what you do is you say, I will pay X amount of money, or I will surrender X amount of time in order to have the right of cancellation or the right to continue the contract. Now, there are two contracts that might at first appearance seem to fall into these, but in fact are valid contracts. These are called requirement contracts and output contracts. Now, requirement contracts are sometimes signed by a manufacturer when he doesn't know how much stuff he's going to buy, but wants to have a contract to buy that stuff from one person. So it's really vague what the consideration is going to be here, because that's what we're talking about here. So let's suppose I'm building laptops, and I go to Intel and I say, I don't know how many laptops I'm going to build this quarter, this year, but I promise that I will buy all my chips, microchips, from you, Intel, and let's agree upon a price. That is a valid contract, even though we don't know what the total is or how much. It may be nothing. I may have a fire in my factory and not be able to manufacture any laptop. So I might buy 0 chips, or I might make 1 million computers with 10 chips in each. I might buy 10 million chips from Intel. Now, output contracts are a little bit different, and you tend to see output contracts more in instances of natural resource production. So a good example here would be an oil well, where you have an oil well, and you've got the oil, but what are you going to do with the oil? You got to sell it to someone who's going to refine it. So I come to you and I say, all right, you got an oil well, I got a refinery. Let's sign an output contract. And what I will agree to as the oil refiner is I will purchase all the oil your well produces. We don't know whether it's going to be 1 gallon or 500 gallons, whether it's going to be 1 barrel or 1 million barrels. But I will agree to purchase all your output. Again, the consideration seems undefined there, but the courts have said, no, that's okay. We can live with that as an output contract. It's valid. All right, let's talk about settlement of claims, something near and dear to the heart of most lawyers. Very frequently, in fact, in almost all cases, I think it's fair to say, people, when they have the option to settle, or when they have a disputed amount of money that's owed, they don't sue, completely go to court, have a verdict, have a trial, win. What they do is they agree to settle. Most criminal cases are settled, most civil cases are settled. So how are these civil cases, because that's what we're concerned, involving business, how are they settled? Well, we use the term accord and satisfaction. First of all, in order to get into this arena, in order to look at this and avoid that pre-existing duty rule, if you owe me $1 million and there's no question you owe me $1 million and you're capable of paying and you won't, it's really not the area we're going to talk about accord satisfaction. But let's suppose we have a contract, you're going to paint my house, you're going to charge me $1,000, You pay my house, but you don't do a great job. There's a few problems. So I say, look, our contract calls for me to pay you when I'm satisfied. I'm not really satisfied with the contract, with your performance. It didn't do very well. And I say, yeah, I kind of screwed up. I used some of the wrong paint. I didn't do the trim right. But it's a pretty good job. You should pay me something. So what there is there is an unliquidated debt. Now, it can be a debt of money, or it can be a debt of labor. It can be a debt of other consideration. But what it means is we don't know how much money should properly be paid under the contract. If we know how much money should be properly paid under the contract, we don't use accord and satisfaction. It's treated differently. Accord and satisfaction is only going to be available when there's a dispute, and it's a reasonable dispute, an unliquidated amount. So, the accord is the name of the new contract. We're going to call the accord the agreement. The satisfaction is what you're going to accept. Okay, so I was supposed to pay $1,000 to paint my house. The house wasn't painted to my satisfaction. You acknowledge it wasn't painted to my satisfaction. There's a dispute of how much money is owed. We agree that you will take $500 as an accord, that's the agreement, and the satisfaction of the debt. So this often happens, and sometimes this is also a negotiation before bankruptcy. So you can have accord and satisfaction. So sometimes we know the amount, but sometimes it's not going to be paid. What's a release? A release is an agreement not to seek any future compensation. So you can have releases from lawsuits. You can have releases from debts owed. Generally, they have to be made in good faith. Releases have to be written. They have to be signed, and the compensation has to be paid in order for them to be effective. A big one here, of course, is a covenant not to sue. Very, very often, you've committed some tort, or you've breached a contract, and I come and I tell you I'm not happy, or my lawyer comes and tells you that I'm not happy. And the question is, all right, what are we going to do? Do you want me to go to court? Do you want me to say all of what you did in court? And sometimes the threat of the cost of court is bad, or the publicity is bad for a company. So the company will say, all right, we will agree, if you sign a covenant not to sue, to pay you X amount of money. Now, sometimes there's other conditions with this. So famously, about 15, 20 years ago, there was sudden acceleration problems with certain German automobiles. What was happening was, for some reason, both Audis, which were made in Germany, and Mercedes, which were made in Germany at the time, were accelerating, even though people weren't pressing the gas pedals. And the Audi people said, well, this is just silly Americans. They don't realize how narrow the pedals are. They're making a mistake. There is no problem. And they didn't want to settle. The result was Audi automobiles got a reputation that they would accelerate suddenly into walls and people and buildings and stuff, and people stopped buying Audi. So Mercedes saw this and said, this is really bad. We don't want it out that our cars suffer from the same thing. So when people threaten to sue, or when people come with these problems, we're going to settle very quickly. None of this is going to get to court. None of it's going to become open. Also, by the way, we will sign a non-disclosure agreement where you're not going to talk about this, but that's second. That's part of the covenant not to sue. You agree not to sue. You agree to take this money. You also agree not to talk about it. An NDA, non-disclosure agreement. All right. General rule, you can have, you have to have consideration flowing from both sides, but there are three quick exceptions. There are some promises that are enforceable without consideration. There's promissory estoppel, which we talked about in last chapter, and then there can be certain payments which are barred by statute of limitations. So let's talk about, sometimes you have a debt, and you say, I know I don't have to pay this debt, but I will agree to pay it. And you can sign a contract reviving the debt. Now, we're not talking bankruptcy, because that's going to be a little bit different. But sometimes there are limitations on the enforcement of a debt. The detrimental reliance and promissory estoppel, we talked about that in the past, but basically you have a clear and definite promise from one party. Hey, will you, do this or sell me that? You have reliance upon that. The reliance is substantial. It becomes fair to enforce it. The other promises enforceable without consideration, strangely enough, are charitable subscriptions. Now, notice it's not charitable donations initially. I'm going to explain it as donation, but it's subscription. So I come to you and I say, all right, I want $100 from you for looking for a cure for cancer. And you say, sure, I'll give you $100. I'll do it. But I don't give you the money right away. So I promise to give you the money for charity. And a week comes by and you say, hey, how about that money? And I said, yeah, I changed my mind. Well, you can't. You promised, right? No. It's just a general donation. You do not have to live up to that. But a subscription is something different. A charitable subscription means someone comes up and you say, we're building a wing on the hospital, and we need to raise $1 million before we can start construction, and I need people to pledge money. And when I get enough people to pledge $1 million, we can start construction. It is a promise to donate money for a specific project. And you say, fine, I'll do it. I will pledge you $1,000. Great. If I get the $1 million, I'll come back and get it from you. So I raised the $1 million someplace else. I come to you and you say, I don't want to give you the money now. And you're not giving me anything, so there's no contract. There's no quid pro quo. The law will say, yeah, we're going to enforce that. It's a charitable subscription for the project. We'll enforce it. Again, promissory estoppel. You can be estopped from denying the existence of the contract because the behavior was reasonable, the reliance existed. Statute of limitations, generally the rule here is you have 2 years to sue to enforce. Now there can be lots and lots of exceptions to that, to sue to enforce a contract. If you agree to pay an old debt that can't be enforced, you do not need new consideration to do so. It's still binding. All right, relatively short chapter. That's going to conclude this one, and we'll pick up with chapter 14.